All right, everyone, we're going to start to talk about some modern art. Modern art is kind of like abstract art, and we've learned about abstract art in the past. Modern art is just a new wave type of art. So let's look at some pictures that we see that describe modern art. Now, modern art is kind of like abstract art in the fact that sometimes when we look at modern art or abstract art, we can't necessarily recognize what it is at first. It might just look like a random area of color and line and shape, but when you start to look closer, you can sometimes start to pick out things that you recognize in the picture. So abstract art could be totally unrecognizable, kind of like this one, or it could be a little bit more recognizable. So we can see some people in this picture, some trees, but it's not necessarily super realistic. The brush strokes are a little bit cartoon-like. So the big deal with modern art was that before modern art and abstract art started happening, everything looked very realistic at this time period. And abstract art was not a thing. People just didn't do it. They thought that good art had to look realistic, like these three paintings right here. So when artists started making pictures like this, and this, and this, with the brushstrokes and the shapes a little bit different than real life, and the lines and colors a little bit crazy, people thought it was a little bit weird. Sculptures were very realistic looking before modern art happened, and when modern art started happening, sculptures of figures or people started to look very abstract like this. So it still looks kind of figure-like, like a person, but it's just a little bit different, just a little bit out there. So still lifes or rooms looks kind of like this, not super real looking like real life. So modern art, the characteristics of abstract or modern art would be that it has little or no recognizable subject. That means we can't really tell what it is, or we can tell kind of what it is. So some abstract artists had big theories about the emotions and why they added certain colors and shapes and what they meant. And some of them were planned out, seemingly kind of random. So abstract artists had different ideas. Some were random, some were very specific about what they meant in their painting. So let's talk about Marcel Duchamp. He was an abstract artist, kind of like Picasso during that time period. We learned about Picasso last year. He was very interested in the camera. So the camera was something that was invented in the 1920s, and that's when Picasso was alive and making abstract art, and this is when abstract art first started to become a thing. So he was really interested in a sequence of movements. So that means capturing many different poses in one picture. The figures or the people in his paintings started to look very abstract. So here's a sequence of movements. Sequential movement is basically capturing many different little movements that when you put them together, it looks like one full motion. So this is one of Marcel Duchamp's photographs. He was really interested in the camera and how it could capture all these little moments. Here's one of his paintings. So he's taking this idea from the camera that he was really interested in, and he's putting it into a painting. So if you can't tell, this is actually a figure walking down a stairwell. So we can kind of see the peachy that reminds us of the skin of a figure, and the way that the legs move back and forth. You can kind of see some directional lines here that swoop around, and some long lines, and some lines that go around like this, kind of reminding me of an arm, and some circular shapes that remind me of heads. So this is an abstract version of a sequence of movements. Fast forward into a contemporary artist, so that means he's alive and making work today. He kind of got some ideas, Peter Janson, from our last artist, Marcel Duchamp. So he makes sculptures that represent a sequence of movements. So he likes showing a person who is just doing one simple single movement, but his sculpture captures every tiny little motion that needs to be put together to make that movement. So the movement might be as small as just jumping up in the air and then coming down, but look at how many different poses are needed to make up that movement. It's kind of like animation. If you put lots of pictures together, you could make a full movement, like a video. So here's a really amazing one. This is probably 100 poses long of his sculpture. And see how little the arm moves each time, and how little the arm moves, and how little the head is moving each time. So very subtle movements. So what we're going to try and do is create a drawing that shows sequential movements, so a sequence of movements. We're going to actually draw 10 different poses of a figure doing some sort of activity that involves movement. So you're going to use something called a paper mannequin to form your poses, and then later we'll add some color. So a paper mannequin just looks like this. It's a figure that you can move the arms and legs and all the body parts around in different directions, and you can pose it and trace it in a different motion. So you're going to think of one movement that your figure could do and how many little poses you need to trace in order to capture that full movement. So here's an artist. A couple years ago, a 5th grader created this project, and he actually wanted to put himself in the picture. So he's doing just this motion of like walking or moving in a walking motion. So he traced way more than 10, and we'll talk about the color that he's adding later and how we're going to add color as well. So on your blank page in your sketchbook, you're going to first make a list of different activities that involve movement. So just simple things like running, kicking a ball, or dancing, and then pick your favorite from that list. Trace your mannequin a couple times in your sketchbook just to get the feel of tracing it and to overlap your mannequin a couple times to see how it feels, and then we can start the project. So here's just kind of how I started. There's some worksheets at your table that will show you different sequences of movements that I've captured from YouTube. You can use this, or you can just think of your own. So I'm using my paper mannequin, and I have my white paper here. I'm just gonna think about the first pose in my movement. So if I'm gonna do a dancer that's leaping up in the air and then coming down, I think I would start with a very still motion and then leap up. So I'm just gonna trace my mannequin in this normal standing still motion with my pencil. Then once I think it looks right, I'm going to trace it right away with a black Sharpie. This will really help you organize the tracing of your figures. So I'm going to go pencil, Sharpie every time I trace my mannequin. So then I'm going to think about, how do I want my motion to go? Do I want it to be going across my paper? So that's how I'm going to kind of do mine. I'm going to think about the next pose, and the leg is kind of coming up and the arms are coming up like this picture. So she's starting to leap in the air. So then once I like that, I'll just trace it with marker, and I can erase the pencil, and I'll just keep going. I think I'm going to go across my paper because I'm going to have a dancer leaping, so I want to go across my paper, and I'm going to think about the next pose. So now she's up in the air, leaping with her arms up and her legs out, and I'll trace that motion. So if you notice, your figures should definitely overlap a little bit. Don't just do one figure, then one, then one. Think about how the artist we looked at before, Peter Jansen, these figures overlap a whole bunch of times. It's more interesting when you overlap the figures. Okay, so you can make your figure go across your paper, or kind of like these students up here. You can keep them kind of together and just move the arms or the legs and keep most of the body together. It's totally up to you how you organize this. You just have to make sure you have 10 poses, and then we'll talk about the color later. So let's get started. We're going to brainstorm a list of motions. Practice tracing your mannequin 2 or 3 times, and then we are going to get started with our final paper.